Tactics and Tet from Presidents Johnson to Nixon of the United States. As you watch the video, make notes on the following as to what were US military tactics and how effective were they. Clearly the United States had the best equipped, most modern military in the world, but how effective were they in applying that in the conditions of the Vietnam conflict? What was the Tet Offensive of 1968 and its consequences, largely political and military, and to an extent economic as well, certainly highlighting economic factors. So, you may remember from the last lesson that after the Gulf of Tonkin incident, President Johnson had been authorised vast sums of money in order to prosecute an undeclared war in support of the regime in the South. And indeed, large numbers of US troops did stop the collapse of the South Vietnamese regime. Between 1965 and 1967, there was indeed heavy fighting, and of course bombing of North Vietnam as well. Bombing itself always has as a consequence large civilian casualties, but did not destroy the morale of the North Vietnamese regime. The US forces basically tried to use what they had as an advantage, i.e. technology and the type of tactics that would win open battles with tanks, accurate artillery and well-trained infantry. However, the Viet Cong and the NVA clearly had no desire for suicidal meetings with the massive modern military of the United States on an open battlefield, so they adopted guerrilla tactics, sabotage, attacking, blowing things up, wrecking supply lines and so on, ambush, hit and run attacks. And within the villages of South Vietnam, there was indeed a large amount of support already for the North Vietnam and the Viet Cong who were operating in the South. But to ensure this was consistent throughout the South, the Viet Cong used a twin policy of indoctrination, lectures on why their cause was right, and on American war crimes, and intimidation for those that didn't buy the program. Village headmen, for example, might be executed if they worked for the Southern Vietnamese regime. So a combination of indoctrination and intimidation. And in fact, support was helped by the American tactics, which did cause death and suffering. US tactics in Vietnam then. So massive bombing in order to disrupt and destroy enemy supply lines, such as the famous Ho Chi Minh Trail. Chemical defoliants, Agent Orange, again to destroy jungle cover where communists hide. Again, this had a horrifying side effect in that it got into the food supply, and subsequently, babies were born deformed, and people were, their DNA itself was damaged by the chemical defoliants. Search and destroy. This was not a war of conquest of territory like World War II, where you could measure your success by how many miles you had advanced. In order to measure success then, and against an elusive enemy within an area you're trying to protect, they used search and destroy. In other words, trying to find, hunt down and destroy Viet Cong bases wherever they were, using helicopters, mobile infantry in helicopters. And again, how do you measure success in this type of conflict? Well, they use the sinister metric of success, kill ratio. If you are killing many more of the enemy than they are of you, hopefully the theory is you will demoralize the enemy in this battle of attrition and they will give up. The simple fact was, though, that the Viet Cong and the North were able to sustain vast amounts of casualties. They had no desire to, but they were prepared to do it in order to win. The question is, how many casualties were Americans at home prepared to tolerate in a democracy which could vote out a government which wanted to prosecute a war? These tactics, search and destroy, kill ratio, inevitably involved civilians being abused and in some cases murdered, and it angered ordinary Vietnamese in the countryside, thus increasing support for the Viet Cong. The Tet Offensive, you should definitely make a note of this, 1968, January 1968, in North Vietnam, a massive offensive during the Tet Festival. This is a huge festival in Vietnam where people return home to their families, and the regime in the South, neither the regime in the South nor the Americans anticipated what was to come, which was a massive simultaneous series of coordinated attacks on towns and bases all over the country. You can see this in the map on the right. You can see the extent of these simultaneous attacks, which completely caught the Americans by surprise. Even within the heart of Saigon itself, which you would expect to be safe, it's the heart of the regime and its American backers. Within the United States Embassy, which should be the safest enclave in a safe city, this was seen on TV screens in America, made people question, are we winning this war? There was a commando team of Viet Cong infiltrated the embassy. They were all repulsed and killed, but nonetheless, to strike at the heart of the American regime, question just how successful the United States was in pacifying this communist nationalist resistance. Well, 50,000 communist troops were killed. The US, in fact, won back the towns in vicious street fighting and lost 1,500 killed in action. On the surface, this seems to be a military disaster for the North, and in pure military terms it was. But what it did do was have consequences which were important and which helped them ultimately to win the conflict. Again, it exposed to people in Vietnam and in America the extent of civilian suffering caused by the war, and it exposed as perhaps not a lie, but certainly a completely inaccurate statement. This is General Westmoreland in the top left, promising in 1967 that the end of the conflict was in sight. Well, the Tet Offensive showed this was clearly not the case. And again, images within America of US soldiers injured, going home in body bags, does not increase support. It also highlights, as well as you can measure a war, I guess, in blood and treasure, in casualties and in economic terms. Well, the US was spending $20 to $30 billion a year on the conflict. Now, President Johnson himself had been elected promising a great society. He had wanted to spend money on social programs to basically help poor people in America, to decrease the gap between rich and poor. And he basically didn't have enough money to do that due to large spending on the Vietnam conflict. 500,000 troops in the country, a vast commitment of resources. And after 3 years of large-scale involvement, remember troops were ramped up in '65, there's no end in sight. It appears to be a swamp, a quagmire that America has wandered into and has no end in sight. So, political consequences, as well as highlighting the costs, as I've said, in terms of the economics. Johnson basically sees the failure in Vietnam, and even though elections were due later in 1968 and he was only in his first term as president, he did not seek a second term. He didn't seek re-election. He felt personally the disaster in Vietnam, the evident quagmire there, it damaged him too much politically. Militarily, bombing was reduced in the north, and in fact peace talks began between the regime in North Vietnam and the United States. Began in Paris in May of '68. Now these peace talks didn't really get anywhere, excuse me, initially, but by summer of 1968 the US was looking for a way out, so clearly enormous impact of the Tet Offensive in this sense. By November of 1968, America has a new president, Richard Nixon, and he is determined to end the conflict in Vietnam.